Shalom, my friends. Welcome to this week's word study, the book of Romeim, chapter 7.
Who do you say?
Now, before we begin, of course, let's pitch this tent with Elohim. Bow our hearts. Dear beloved Abba Father, Abba, we come before you this day to worship you, to praise you and thank you, Abba, for teaching us how your word washes us and how we grow in our understanding through the washing of your word. And Abba, we praise you and we thank you for revealing to us how that leads to our learning to pitch our tents with you and seeing how you pitch your tent with us. Thank you, Father, for revealing yourself, your beloved Bain, Yeshua, and your indwelling Ruach HaKodesh to us. Thank you, Abba, for your berakah on today's study as we give this day to you, Yeshua, and Ruach HaKodesh. In Yeshua's beloved name we pray, Father, the name you gave him, the name above all names, Yahweh. Yahweh, our Elohim, Yahweh Echad. Amen. Now, in today's study, take note, in certain verses, you're going to hear me say the teachings of our Father instead of Torah or law, as you might see in your Bible. Because the Ruach speaks of the Torah in some places referring to the teachings of the Father, and yet in other places, Torah or law is referring to a person's own laws, their own Torah, their own teachings, or the teachings of sin. So, by shifting my reading today to focus on teachings rather than Torah in certain places, this chapter will be delivered with much greater understanding. Let's remember, my friends, Torah simply means teaching. And, certain words, that's why I like to do this, because certain words become locked in our understanding to meaning something that oftentimes they should not. A good example is Torah. Most Bible versions interpret that as law, so everybody thinks, oh, it's law. Oh, his commandments, those are laws. What happens if you break a law? You get punished. Absolutely wrong. The Torah means teaching. And the Torah is the Father's loving instructions to his children, showing them how to avoid the snares and traps of Hashatan, Satan. So, let's jump into Romeim 7. That's Romans chapter 7, where we see how believers are united to Yeshua. Now, we ended our study last week with the last verse of Romeim 6, which said, "The wages of sin is death, but the free gift of Elohim," that is his remarkable, overwhelming gift of pitching tents with him, "is everlasting chai in Mashiach, Yeshua, our Adon." And again, what is chai? Chai is life. Everyone has life forever. No one ever ceases to exist. But chai is life without any sorrow, suffering, tears, darkness of any kind. Something that no one has ever known, nor will anyone know until we go home and see our place in eternity. So the Ruach continues here with chapter 7, verse 1. "Or do you not know, believers, for I am speaking to those who know the teachings of our Father, that the teaching of the Father has jurisdiction to rule over a person as long as that person lives. Verse 2, for example, a married woman is bound and remains bound by the teachings of the Father to her husband while he lives. Now, if her husband dies, she's released and is then exempt from the teachings of the Father concerning her husband. Verse 3, accordingly, a married woman will be designated as an adulteress if she unites herself to another man, meaning if she literally joins with another man in an illicit sexual relationship while her husband is alive. However, if her husband dies, she's free from the teachings of the Father regarding marriage, so that she's not an adulteress if she marries another man. So, if a woman's married, her husband dies, she's free to marry another man. If he hasn't died, no. And if that upsets you, don't be concerned about it. Talk to Abba Father about it. He'll answer you. He'll give you his direction. Verse 4, therefore, my fellow believers, you too died to the Torah through the crucifixion of Mashiach, so that you may belong to another, that is, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit to Elohim. Verse 5, when we were living in the flesh, when we were trapped by sin, the sinful passions which were awakened by that which the teachings of the Father identify as sin, we're at work in our body to bear fruit for death, since the willingness to sin led to death. And what is death? Separation from Elohim. We talked about this last week with Adam and Eve, Adam and Chawah. Yahweh told Adam, the day you eat from that tree, the fruit thereof, that day you will die. Now, he wasn't talking about a physical death. Adam lived for many, many, many years after that. But Adam died. He experienced death, meaning he experienced separation from Elohim. The indwelling Ruach was left him. And there's two verses in Genesis where you see the word naked. In one verse, you see the word naked. A couple of verses later, you see the word naked again. One of those words, naked, means physically naked. The other one is not the same word in Aramaic Hebrew. The other one is talking about the Ruach had left them, and they felt unclothed spiritually. So death is anything that separates us from Elohim is an experience of death. Oftentimes, depression really is nothing more or less than a lack of fellowship with Elohim. Verse 6, but now we have been released from the Torah and its penalty, having died through Mashiach to that by which we were held captive by, so that we serve Elohim in the newness of the Ruach and not in the oldness of the letter of the Torah. That is, the letter of the law. That is, obeying the teachings of the Father strictly through works. And what's it talking about when it talks about the penalty of the Torah. That's probably not the best English word. I'd have to do a study on that too. But the penalty of the Torah is really talking about the Torah reveals sin to us, and that can be painful. But we're no longer experiencing that, having died to it through the crucifixion of Yeshua, and having the righteousness of Yeshua in us. As we grow in Yahweh's word, as we're washed by his word, that our reaction to the ideas of sin change. Verse 7, what shall we say then? Is the Torah sin? Certainly not. Elohim forbid. On the contrary, if it had not been for the teachings of the Father, I would not have recognized sin. For I would not have known, for example, about coveting what belongs to another. And I would not have had any sense of guilt if the teachings of the Father had not repeatedly told me, you shall not covet. Verse 8, but sin, finding an opportunity through the commandment to express itself, produced in me every kind of coveting and selfish desire. That is, the awareness of it. It's kind of funny when you begin to study anything, you start becoming aware of it, and that's what the Torah does. If Yahweh's loving instruction to us says, I don't want you to covet anything that belongs to someone else, and you meditate on that, and his word washes you, and you grow in his word, then you start recognizing covetousness for the first time. I know when I was a young boy and I was studying commercial art, I started studying about colors. And all of a sudden, I became aware of color like I had never been before. I mean, it was something I very readily recognized. I was like, wow, I see that vermilion. It's, look there, and crimson red. That's I started becoming aware of color because I was being taught about it. And that's what the Ruach is showing us here through Shaul. That's what the Torah, the Father's loving instructions, is supposed to do with us. He goes on, for without the teachings of the Father, sin is dead. The recognition of sin, that is inactive. Without the Father's teachings, we wouldn't recognize sin. Without seeing the Father say, I don't want you to covet things. Prior to that, you wouldn't recognize coveting things as something that's not righteous. Verse 9, I was once alive without knowledge of the teachings of the Father, but when the commandment came and I understood its meaning, that is, when he first read the Father's commandment or heard about it and understood its meaning, sin became alive and I died, because the teachings of the Father sentenced me to death. Verse 10, and the very commandment which was intended to bring chai actually proved to bring death for me. Verse 11, for sin, seizing its opportunity through the commandment, beguiled and completely deceived me, and using it as a weapon, it killed me. Verse 12, so then, the teachings of the Father are Kodesh, and his commandments are Kodesh, and righteous, and good. His commandments are Kodesh, dedicated to us. They're good for us, and they are righteous. Verse 13, therefore, has that which is good, the teachings of the Father, then become death to me? Certainly not. Elohim forbid. But sin, in order that it might be revealed as sin, was producing death in me by using this good thing as a weapon, using the Torah, the Father's teachings, as a weapon, so that through the commandments, sin would become exceedingly sinful. Even, if you knew, that you shouldn't covet things, seeing the Father's instruction not to covet made it bigger for you, makes it more wrong than it was before. Now, what follows, verse 14 on, we see the conflict of two natures. Verse 14, we know that the teachings of the Father are spiritual, but I'm a creature of the flesh. I'm worldly. I'm self-reliant, carnal, and unspiritual, sold into slavery to sin, serving it under its control. Verse 15, for I do not understand my own actions. I am baffled and bewildered by them. I've always really, I guess like you, I've always gotten tickled by this next section with Shaul. He says, I do not do what I want to do, but instead I do the very thing I hate. Yielding to my human nature, my worldliness. Verse 16, now if I habitually do what I do not want to do, that means I agree with the teachings of the Father, confessing that they are good and that they are morally excellent. Verse 17, so now, if that is the case then, it's no longer I who do the disobedient thing which I despise, but the sin nature which lives in me. I said this section always tickles me because I guess, when I first read it, I had to laugh. I mean, we all go through this when you start being washed by the Word. You start realizing, I'm constantly doing what I wish I didn't do. I'm constantly not doing what I wish I would do. You start seeing this battle between these two natures that are being pointed out here. The battle, the war that goes on between the flesh and the ruach. The flesh just has a natural tendency to do the things of the world. Why? Because it's of the world, it tends to desire the things it can see and to kind of disregard the things it cannot see. In other words, the flesh would worship, food and sensuality, money, and kind of disregard Elohim. You can't see him. A lot of people unless anyone is being washed by and growing in the Word, Even if they say, hey, I believe in God, I go to church every Sunday. I mean, they could be very, very strongly religious people. They're not aware of their sinful nature, because the flesh thinks, this is the way it is, Yeah, I believe in God, but, I can't see him. I can't talk to him. I can't have a cup of coffee with him. I'm busy having my coffee with, my neighbor and gossiping and, having sensuality and all these things. And like Shaul, or the Ruach is pointing out here through Shaul, it's not until you start being washed by the word that you start recognizing the sin nature of the flesh. And then things change. And actually, it starts becoming easier because the Ruach, you start becoming filled with the Ruach, you start growing in your spiritual nature, and your flesh nature starts diminishing. And aside from recognizing sinful things, you start lacking the desire for them. That's the exciting part, fun part. Verse 18, for I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my flesh, my human nature, my worldliness. For the willingness to do good is present in me, but the doing of good is not. Verse 19, for the good that I want to do, I do not do. Here he goes again. I practice the very evil that I do not want. Verse 20, but if I'm doing the very thing I do not want to do, then I'm no longer the one doing it. That is, it's not me that acts, but the sin nature which lives in me. He's talking about, the flesh has a mind of its own. And it's true. 3 years ago, a little more than 3 years ago now, I came home from the hospital. And while I was in the hospital, there was a period for 2 weeks, they would not let me eat or drink anything. Whew, man, Yeshua fasted for 40 days and nights. I don't think I'm capable of that. Now, I was being fed intravenously, so that I wasn't dehydrating, and I was getting nutrition, I don't know. They would not let me put anything in my mouth, liquid or solid. And when I came home, there was one day my sister made me a meal. And, my point here is that the flesh has a life of its own that's different from us. And this is what, the Ruach is talking about here with Shaul. He says, it's not me that acts, but the sin nature which lives in me. Or it's not me that acts, it's my flesh. Now, my sister made me this meal. And, there's nothing really... I sat down, I put the fork into the bowl, and I put the food in my mouth. And I started chewing it, and out of the blue, I uncontrollably started weeping. And I'm telling you, my friends, it's exactly what Shaul is saying here. It was not me that was weeping. It was my flesh. My body. My flesh had been so deprived when my taste buds experienced the flavor, eating. There's something so powerful about eating. After Yeshua was raised from the dead, every time you see him in the scriptures, he's eating. And, we're told not to eat with wicked people. Why? There's something about eating and eating and fellowship. Well, anyway, I burst into weeping. It surprised me. It was involuntary. It wasn't me weeping. It was my flesh. This is a hard thing to explain. And this is what, Shaul was saying here. It's not me, but my flesh that sins. Well, at that point, it wasn't me that was weeping. It was my flesh that was weeping over having food and flavor and taste again. Verse 21. So I find it to be the teaching of my inner self that evil is present in me. Me, the one who wants to do good. Verse 22, for I joyfully delight in the teachings of Yahweh in my inner self, with my new nature. Verse 23, but I see a different teaching and rule of action in the members of my body, in its appetites and desires, waging war against the teachings of my mind and subduing me, or rather, the flesh waging war with its teachings against the teachings of my ruach, and subduing me and making me a prisoner of the teachings of sin, or the teachings of the flesh, the teachings of the world, which is within my members. Now, note here, the HalleluYah Scriptures is definitely a bit askew in the book of Romaim, my friends, sometimes printing law where it should say Torah, and sometimes printing Torah where it should say law. And verse 23 is an easy-to-see example of that. No matter, nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes for now. Verse 24, wretched and miserable man that I am. Shaul, I'm telling you, Shaul's writings are marvelous. Wretched and miserable man that I am, who will rescue me and set me free from this body of death? I'm constantly doing what I don't want to do. I'm constantly not doing what I want to do. There's a war going on between my flesh and my ruach. Who can save me? Verse 25. Thanks be to Yahweh for my deliverance through Yeshua HaMashiach, our Adon. So then, on the one hand, I myself with my mind serve the Torah of Yahweh, the teachings of Yahweh, Abba Father. But on the other hand, with my flesh, my human nature, and my worldliness, I serve the teachings of sin. So there we have chapter 7 in Romaim. Shaul topping off this meal with this whole bit about there's a war going on. We all have two natures, the nature of the flesh, the teachings of the flesh, the teachings of sin. The flesh is sinful, and the ruach, our spiritual nature, as we grow in the Word, recognizes righteousness, and that's what we want. We want righteousness. And there are times where our flesh causes us to partake of sin, and it's like, that's not what I want. And yet, I'm constantly doing what I don't want. and I'm constantly not doing what I wish I would be doing. Again, these born-again Christians out there who say, I'm born again, therefore I don't sin anymore. There's people out there that insist they have not sinned ever since they were born again. You've got to be... Talk about deception. You're deceiving yourself. I mean, every time they do something that the Ruach wouldn't want them to do, every time they don't do the things that the Ruach would want them to do, they're saying that never happens. You know, that only says to me that they're not being washed by the Word. They don't recognize sin, because the washing of the Word, receiving Abba Father Yahweh's teachings to his loving children, makes us aware of sin. So, you know, as we grow in the Word and we're washed by the Word, we start recognizing the sin that goes on in our life, and we don't like it. But if you try and control it, I'll never do that again. Now you're trying to be your own God. You're missing the whole thing. When that goes on, you go to Abba Father, 1 John 1:9. You confess it to him. Say, Abba, this goes on. I don't like it. I don't want it. And yet I keep doing it. Help me. You're the one who changes me. I'm not going to try and change myself. I'm not going to get caught up in that lie from Hashatan. I'm just going to be diligent. I'm just going to spend more time in your Word. I want to be washed by your Word. And Abba, Father, I want to see you change my nature. Make the Ruach in me bigger than the flesh in me. And he will. But, you know, don't beat yourself over the head for making mistakes. As long as we're here, until we go home, we're going to make mistakes. It's okay. Just go to Abba Father about it. Keep washing yourself in the Word. Be patient. Trust in him to make the changes in you. Let's bow our hearts. Dear beloved Abba Father. Oh, Abba, we understand what you are telling us through Shaul. We constantly do things that we don't want to do. We constantly don't do things that we wish we were doing. Abba, we want to grow in our ability to be more pleasing to you. And we want to grow in our understanding of the sinful nature of the flesh. We thank you, Abba, for opening our eyes, our ears, and our hearts so that we can see, hear, and understand these things that go on, so that we can develop a stronger appetite for righteousness and a greater distaste for unrighteousness. We trust that growth in ourselves to you, Abba Father. As we give this day to you, Yeshua and Ruach HaKodesh, praying to you, Abba, in Yeshua's Kodesh name, the name you gave him, the name above all names, Yahweh, Yahweh our Elohim, Yahweh Echad. Amen. Praise Elohim. He's so good. That's our study for this week, my friends. As always, I hope and I pray that these studies are a beracha to you and yours. Abba willing, I'll see you here again next week. Until then, shalom, my friends.
it's another working day. Some would rather let it lie, but the question still remains.